He flinched as if someone had slammed a door on the inside of his chest. The gunshot sounded like a punctuation mark in the cavernous arrival hall, dull, final. And the woman beside him folded her boarding pass with the mechanical calm of someone who had rehearsed small deceits for years. For a heartbeat, Matteo Versetti's world narrowed to the shallow, precise sound of her fingers creasing paper. And he realized with a clarity that felt almost obscene how much he wanted to know the shape of that hand, to lock it to his palm and never let it move again. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. "You're lost too, sir?" Leila Santos asked, voice low and practiced like steam under pressure. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the movement both unremarkable and defiant. He could smell espresso from the sleeve of the cup she held, and the scent, so ordinary, so human, collapsed something defensive in him. He gave her a dry half-smile that did not reach his eyes. "You could say that?" She expected a brush-off, a courteous half-truth from a stranger in a suit who looked like he belonged to elevator rides and executive lounges. Instead, his gaze held hers with an intensity that made the airport's glass and glares recede. There was menace in him, yes, the kind bred by careful economy of words and the polished edges of a reputation built to intimidate. But there was also loneliness so vast it hurt to look at. Leila's pulse stuttered. In another wife, she would have looked away. Matteo Versetti had the kind of face that newspapers used as shorthand for power. Photographers captured a jaw that cut angles, a hairline so neat it might have been drawn with a ruler, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Boardrooms loved him, encrypted channels feared him. Where Versetti Holdings went, markets bent and alliances were weighed in a silence his presence filled. Yet none of those profiles bothered to imagine the man in the coat of a suit who flinched at a gunshot in an airport, because the sound had turned his body into a ledger of small failures. There, in that brief second, the niece he had failed to protect in his worst nightmares, and the accountant of betrayals he'd long held in his chest. "This gate leads to Lisbon," Leila went on, because the question needed a bridge before the interrogation. "Unless you're—" She let the sentence float between them like a paper plane, meant to change flights. He studied her the way a chess player studies a pawn he thinks might be a queen. "Lisbon," Matteo repeated. "No, my flight's delayed. I don't mind a coffee." He closed that space with a tilt toward the cafe kiosk and the offer of a shared table, an invitation that was careful and obvious.
People like him never asked for favors, but they made them feel inevitable. Leila's life was a series of calculated invisibilities. By days, she frothed milk and smiled over the counter of a specialty cafe in the industrial rim of the city, a place of card machines, late-shift nurses, and the kind of regulars who learned your kids' names. By night, she became a phantom in a glowing cave of code, part of a ragged collective that leaked proof to the world. Contracts, bank ledgers, forensic maps of corruption that smelled like gasoline and old coffee. They called themselves the Lanterns, because even thieves sometimes kept faith with small lights. She was supposed to be invisible to men like Matteo Versetti. Power was a predator that smelled herself in the smallness of others. But a year earlier, she had been the one who rerouted a hit, an algorithmic little murder that slid from one inbox to another, because the target had been a 4-year-old with her father's eyes. Matteo's niece, Sophia, had been sleeping in a villa that hummed with alarms and threats. The hit should have been final. Leila had worked the back channels, rewritten the coordinates, and watched the attempt dissolve into a bureaucratic nothing. She told herself she did it for the child's laugh taped to a voice memo, for the smallness of innocence, and perhaps for the adrenaline that came with rewriting fate. She had not known then that the man who had signed the liquidation contract was the same man with winter steel eyes sitting in front of her now. She had not known that Matteo's decision that day was a ledger line that still bled, how pride had made him sign what he thought necessary, how regret dug at him in long, deep winters. She saw him as a silhouette on screens. He saw the world as ledgers. They had danced around each other across the dark net and executive summaries, their steps blind to the danger of recognition. As they waited for the delayed flight, Matteo asked about the coffee shop where she worked, the name of the place, the owner he might have met at a charity gala, and she answered with the lightness of someone who had rehearsed modesty 100 times. He asked about Lisbon, and she told him, honest enough, that she was headed there for a friend's wedding and hated how airports made people confess things they'd rather forget. Matteo laughed once, a small sound that loosened the air between them, and it felt like a confession in its own right. "You shouldn't fold yours like that," he said suddenly, nodding at the boarding pass she'd smoothed down with worn fingers. "You'll crease the barcode." She straightened the crease, embarrassed in that private way that always came when someone with authority pointed out a detail you hadn't noticed. "I've folded worse tickets," she said, "and more lives." It came out softer than she meant. He watched her with something like curiosity, merciless, searching.
"Lives?" "My day job," she said, and then, on impulse, because she had always been fed on the thrill of small lies and half-truths, she added, "and a messy, illegal hobby. Someone has to keep the corrupt honest." Matteo's face didn't change. It registered the words the way a man registers a gust of winter wind, bracing, possibly dangerous, but negotiable. "Honesty is a dangerous vocation," he said, "especially when it comes without permission." The conversational exchange should have remained a flirtation between the lonely and the curious. Airports, after all, are places of accidental intimacy, a borrowed cigarette, a forgotten umbrella, a shared column of light over the arrivals board. But the world they occupied was not ordinary. The Vercetti name could make allies bloom and enemies wither. Even a stray word, careless, heartfelt, could ricochet into boardrooms and servers with the gravity of consent. Across the concourse, a screen flickered with a headline, "Vercetti Holdings under scrutiny." A data leak had surfaced that morning, unnamed sources claiming that funds earmarked for philanthropic disaster relief had been rerouted into shell corporations. It was the kind of scandal Matteo had learned to swallow with measured fury. His lawyers drafted statements while his sister Elena burned through phone lines. The leak was, in truth, an irritation until it was connected to a single trace, a piece of code no outside firm could craft, a signature the collective of lanterns relished. It was, Leela knew, in the way one knows the shape of a scar on a map, the product of someone testing a wound. He watched the headline with a blankness that did not look like surprise. "Unfortunate timing," he said, and for the first time his voice looked like a thing that might be worn to hide something. But not fatal. His hands were bare of any nervous motion. He moved like a man who had rehearsed his reactions to scandal the way an opera singer rehearses breath, precise, contained, invulnerable. Leela felt that she had to say something, some small moral ballast to anchor a conversation that waded toward the dangerous. "If the leak is true," she said, "people will get hurt. Maybe not the ones who deserve it, but the ones who already had to pay for other people's mistakes." Matteo's jaw tightened, a small mechanical shift. He squared his shoulders the way someone prepares to assume a mantle. "People always get hurt," he said, and the sentence fell as both truth and warning. There was a gap of silence then, an awkward pause where two very different kinds of armor regarded each other across a table. Leela's fingers traced the rim of her cup. Matteo's thumbs arranged the crease in his boarding pass, as if that small act could reassemble the world. In the pause, she could see the outline of the man who made choices in rooms where no one else was allowed to speak, and he could see the ghost of a woman who knew how to reroute destiny in the language of code.
"Why Lisbon?" Matteo asked, voice softer now, as if curiosity could become something like confession. "For a friend," she said. "She's getting married. I make a terrible wedding guest. I'd prefer hacking an altar than toasting champagne, but she insists." Matteo's smile was sudden, almost cruel in its gentleness. "Altar hacking," he said, "an odd hobby." She shrugged. "You'd be surprised what gets hacked when someone thinks it's the right thing." He regarded her like a man cataloging an unknown artifact, and the cataloging felt intimate in a way that made Leela's pulse leap. She wanted to ask him whether he ever thought about the people whose names were in the margins of his ledgers, whether he ever felt the weight of decisions beyond reputations and market shares. Instead, she tucked the question away. People like him, architects of damage and salvation both, did not yield to casual philosophies in airport cafes. When the boarding call finally echoed, Matteo rose first, his movements economical as always. He left an unspoken invitation in his wake, something like a bookmark in the conversation. Leela folded her pass, slipping it back into her pocket with the deliberateness of someone who kept little things as proof. As she stepped away, she said, before she could stop herself, "If you ever get lost,
"You should ask a stranger for a coffee more often." He paused at the threshold, an image from some future she could not yet imagine catching at his face. "And if the stranger is trying to destroy you?" he asked. "Then you pay for the coffee," she replied, and a laugh came out of her that tasted like too strong espresso. He smiled, a small concession. Deal. Neither of them knew, yet, how quickly that game of small lies would become an allegation, a strategy, and then a claim that might cost them everything. As Mateo walked away through the tide of people, the world resumed its hum. Screens scrolled, shoes clicked, a mother steadied a stroller. But the sound of the gunshot still echoed in Lila's chest, the echo of a night baked into her bones. The night she had chosen to break an algorithm and not mind the consequences of what that choice might later mean. He didn't leave her entirely. Over the next week, Matteo Vercetti folded like a shadow into corners of Lila's life she had told herself were unassailable. The hours between closing the cafe and logging into the dark network where the lanterns stitched their proofs into public bloodlines. At first it was indirect, an email from an assistant asking if she was safe traveling to Lisbon, a courier who left a small tin of biscotti on the cafe counter with a card that said only, "For the woman who folds tickets with intent." Lila kept the tin behind the counter like a talisman and told herself the rule she'd learned long ago. Everything with a logo belonged to someone, everything anonymous belonged to everyone. The assistants felt at moments like protection, at others it felt like a net.
She began to notice details that made her chest tighten, a sedan that slowed at a distance when she walked home, a man in a gray suit who always took the same seat at the cafe and ordered espresso at the exact time she finished her shift. He took no notes, made no calls. He sat with the stillness of someone waiting to see if a plant in a cracked pot would bloom. Lila turned such things over the way a jeweler turns fragile glass, careful, searching. She had trained herself to read the margins where surveillance left fingerprints, the way the world rearranges politely around power. One night, after an ill-advised sprawl of overtime and a flask of espresso that tasted like memory, she found Matteo standing outside the lantern's safe house by the river. He hadn't come in. He stood a few feet away, nearer to the streetlights than the safety of their hidden door, hands shoved into the pockets of a coat that looked like it belonged in boardroom photographs. He was smaller than the image magazine sold and still larger than anyone else on the pavement. He looked like someone waiting for a verdict. "You shouldn't be here," she said, the words flat with the practiced talk of someone who gave orders to people dying to misbehave. He didn't smile. "I'm here because I can't find sleep at home, or at the office, or in airports." His breath made a pale cloud. "And because I thought, perhaps foolishly, that you might appreciate tea that doesn't come from a kettle with a logo." She let him come closer by the width of her cynicism. "You sound like a man who reads too many self-help books. Or a man who has had too many reasons to ask strangers to keep their distance," he replied. For a long second he looked at her, and she felt like the subject of an inspection. "Are you one of them?" he asked, and he said it without the usual caution that made men like him surgical about pronouns. "One of the lanterns." Her first instinct was to lie, to mollify with a false denial. The lanterns owed their lives to anonymity. A careless answer could be a firing pin. But lying felt suddenly like a small betrayal, like folding a boarding pass when the barcode might be the only thing that keeps you from a fall. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She offered instead the truth she could afford. "Sometimes," she said, "depends on the night." He considered that, and in his face there was emotion that might have been relief or evaluation. "They leaked something yesterday," he said. "Funds. Philanthropy turned into a web of shell accounts." She tasted the sentence before it left the air, a professional acknowledgement, a small sting. "I know," she said. "We've been following the paper trail for months. The code points to a signature pattern, not easy to trace, but—" She stopped. Her mouth went dry, not from fear, but because the outline of a night a year ago slid into view with new edges. A detail she had thought safely buried under layers of misdirection was now a possibility. If the lanterns were tangling with Vercetti Holdings, then the man whose assistant sent biscotti and whose sedan watched her with measured indifference might not be merely curious. He might be implicated. She had rerouted a hit once. She had moved a child's fate so it would not end in pinpricks of red. And the only reason the hit had dissolved into noise was because the code had been vulnerable to her subtle manipulations. If Mateo connected the dots, he read her expression like a ledger. You were at the airport when someone, he gestured at a distance, where the city's lights were the color of tempered steel, was shot. Leela's fingers tightened on the ring she always wore, cheap, silver, scarred with a tiny chip from a life of invisible labor. I was, she said, but I left. I don't like crowds after that. Most people would run if they thought someone was watching. He moved and stood beside her in an odd, companionable silence. You didn't. I don't like leaving things half done, she said. The admission was softer than she had intended. It was a confession that surprised both of them, and Mateo stepped back as if the confession had legs he needed to measure. He said nothing for a long time. I want to help, he said finally. The words should have been simple. Help was the kind of thing that could be purchased in the world he inhabited. Lawyers, private investigators, pressure on regulatory agencies. But there was syntax in the way he said it, the quiet gravity of someone offering himself as a kind of shelter. Leela had been sheltered before. She knew the cost. She also knew that there is a different hunger that inhabits lonely men and women, the hunger for someone to see you and not flinch. He needed that as much as she needed an ally. Why? She asked. It was a guarded why, a coin dropped into a fountain where the engine of fate might be starting. Why help me? Because you want to look humane? Because you think helping the accused sometimes buys absolution? He blinked, as if surprised by the accusation. Because the woman at the airport made me remember the things I pretend don't exist, and because I don't like people who make a habit of hurting children. Leela's chest tightened. Mateo's niece flickered through the back of her mind like a photograph left half developing. He had confessed without telling her that the ledger of his life contained a particular wound. The confession made him suddenly less like the predator she had imagined, and more like a man learning how to live with a ledger that sometimes bled. I don't trust you, she said, because the truth had to be laid first, like a foundation. He nodded. I don't expect you to. They started a precarious collaboration that felt more like a dance than a strategy. Mateo offered resources, surveillance teams with the correct legal paperwork, data analysts with government clearances. He did not ask to be part of the Lantern's operation. He asked instead to sit on the edge of it, to be a man who could advise and step in when the stakes became lethal. Leela agreed with a caveat that she kept returning to like a rosary: independence. She would not allow herself to be bankrolled into silence. The Lanterns were wary. They knew how Vercetti tended to move. But the leak he could neutralize, or at least help contain, and that was a temptation they could not ignore. The first test of their shaky truce came when a tranche of documents hit the open net. Medical invoices, falsified procurement contracts, a chain of payments that led to a shell company with a name like smoke. The public outcry was immediate and hungry. As the company issued calm denials, Mateo's office began to move in silence. An internal audit, a claim to investigate, a promise of transparency. The press ate it up. Vercetti Holdings' image control apparatus is built on the scaffolding of public doubt. They knew which images to tilt and which to burn. Leela watched the machine from the other side and felt like a person standing at the mouth of a storm. She had always thought that truth, once let loose, would be pure enough to clarify wrongdoing itself. Instead, she saw how fast truth could be co-opted, how narratives were pliant, and how guilt could be reframed into scapegoats. In the Lantern's chat room, arguments flamed. Some wanted to push harder and let the truth decimate the company entirely. Others argued for surgical strikes, proofs that would expose the corrupt without leaving innocent workers to suffer the fallout. Leela drifted toward the latter, partly out of principle, and partly because she could not stomach the thought of the poor being crushed under the weight of big revelations. Mateo watched those internal debates the way a chess master watches a rook deemed too brave. He offered what he could without taking. He introduced her to people who could clean data trails, and to a woman, a compliance officer, who had the peculiar skill of folding legal pressure into a conversation that felt like reconciliation. To the casual observer, he was helping a charity with a PR problem. To Leela, his assistance was a ledger line that might be solidifying into something else, a claim on her loyalty. Between the practical collaborations, there were moments that made her forget the danger in the margins and remember only the man who had stood outside the Lantern's door. He started to appear in the small places where her life bled into the daylight, at a charity drive where she served espresso to exhausted volunteers, and Mateo had arrived with his sister Elena, a controlled smile and a measured handshake, at a photography exhibit he sponsored, where she was invited by a mutual friend and found herself standing beside him amid the hush of glass and light.
There were conversations that slipped into the late hours, the kind of talk that could unmake an armor if you let it. Childhood scars, the taste of supermarket coffee at 3 a.m, the way grief smells like burnt sugar. He told her about the niece he had not been able to protect utterly, about the nights he spent replaying choices until they bled into one another. He never spoke of police files or the specific orders he had signed. He spoke instead of the shape those documents left in his chest. Leela told him small things too. Why she had begun hacking, a childhood of women who stitched and prayed, a father who had left a ledger of unpaid debts in a cardboard box, evidence that sometimes poverty is paper thin. She kept the most dangerous details to herself, the syntax of their operations, the names of some lanterns, the exact night she had rerouted a hit, like a surgeon keeping an incision slightly hidden. She wanted, perversely, to be trusted for being honest about the things that mattered, and to withhold the things that could kill her. And then, the first fracture. In the Lantern's feeds, a thread erupted with a screenshot of an internal memo. For SETI Trust, authorize asset relocation, emergency. The memo was timestamped 3 weeks prior and bore a signature block that matched Mateo's initials. It was a direct, nasty thing, a public allegation that Mateo had authorized certain moves that could be construed as siphoning funds. The chat room detonated, fingers typed in hysteria, accusations ricocheted, and someone posted a grainy photo of a villa, Edenic and manicured, with a child swing in the yard. The image carried with it the scent of a question: who scrambled funds while a child sloughed beneath the wrong kind of sky? If the Lanterns hoped to push truth to the world, they now had an object of retribution that couldn't be ignored. In the feed, someone tagged Leela directly and added with a cruelty that tasted like triumph: "We found a signature pattern. Match this to the airport night. If you rerouted the hit, tell us you didn't." Her hands shook because the accusation was a paradox wrapped in heat. If she confessed to rerouting the hit, she would reveal a wound that could be stitched by the same man she had been trusting. If she denied it, she would be lying to people who had become, in the flicker of lamplight and late-night coat sessions, a fragile family. Her greatest dread made itself known. The possibility that she had not just been anonymous to Vercetti, but had been known in the ledger ways that destiny sometimes reveals. That she had been the ghost who meddled in a life that had led men to sign death warrants. She opened communications with Mateo that evening. They spoke in code at first, everybody did, but there was an edge now, a small, terrible urgency to their exchanges. He asked direct questions: who leaked the memo, who had access. She offered no answers that would reveal her hand.
He grew still in a way that made her want to reach for him and push him away at once. Then he said, simply, "They will come for you." There was no accusation in it, only a fact as precise as a legal brief. Leela's mouth turned dry. "Yes," she said. "You can run," he offered, voice low. "You can disappear. I can arrange it." And there it landed, a choice that felt like the hinge of an implausible door. To run was to sacrifice the Lanterns, to abandon a project that had steadied her when the world had been unkind. To stay was to risk being unmasked and sacrificed as an example. To accept Mateo's offer was to barter autonomy for safety, to allow a man she barely trusted to write a safe narrative around her. She looked at him and saw, for a breath, the man who had not been able to sleep, who had stood on the edge of the street like a sentinel. She saw the niece in his eyes, and in the space where grief had hollowed him, she saw a kind of fierce, guilty tenderness. It made the decision more complicated than any ledger could summarize. "I can't run," she said at last. Her voice was small but fierce. "Not from this. Not when I started it." Mateo closed his eyes. For a moment she thought she would see him make a choice the way one settles an account. Instead, he reached for her hand, an almost terroristic move for a man who had rarely let his fingers be seen in affection, and it was not a claim. It was a proposition. "Then you'll let me stand in front of whatever comes," he said. "On your terms. No strings. No control. I'll take the heat if you let me." Trust had never been a commodity he could buy with money. Still, the offer felt wild and dangerous, and, for reasons she couldn't entirely catalog, honest. She looked at the hand he offered, at those winter steel eyes softened into something like supplication, and remembered the way he'd flinched at the sound of a gunshot. She thought of the child who had been spared because someone had reached into an algorithm and tugged at the ropes. She thought of the Lanterns, of nights of code and coffee, of being small and brave in the fluorescent glow of a monitor. "On my terms," she said. The words felt like a small victory and a small surrender all at once. Mateo nodded. "On your terms." When she walked back into the safe house after their meeting, the room buzzed with a cold, urgent energy. People were typing with the learned speed of those who read lives not as narratives but as equations. Someone thrust a tablet at her, and the ledger scrolled. Lines of transfers, shell company names, timestamps like the steps of a waltz. Her chest hitched as she watched it, because one line had her initials in metadata, an after image of something she had done in the dark, a ghost keyed to her username.
She recognized the signature pattern she had once used to reroute tragedy, and she felt madness bloom in her throat. The difficult dilemma was no longer a question of trust or safety.
It was a ledger that showed her fingerprints on the very act she had thought was secret. If she confessed, she would reveal herself to Vercetti and to the Lanterns. She might be a martyr or a traitor. If she denied, she might be being used to obscure another truth, that the hit had been signed intentionally and then redirected for reasons she could not immediately parse. Matteo's offer sat next to the revelation like a battery of light. He had offered himself as a shield. The ledger suggested he might instead be the reason the world wanted her blood. The stakes reoriented into something crystalline and cold. To trust a man with everything to lose, or to burn down the thing that might save others. She folded the tablet shut before anyone could see her tremble. Outside, in the hum of the city and the patient glare of surveillance lights, the choice took shape. It was a kind of asking for directions only the heart could understand, and the heart often had terrible taste in maps. When she finally told Matteo that night, by text at first, then with a voice that sounded too young and too old, he was quiet. He read the ledger like a man reading his own obituary, slow and terrible. "If that's you," he said, "then I owe you the truth. If that's not you, then someone is framing you with the very hand that saved his niece." She didn't know which sentence hurt more. He would not let her face what came alone. It was an offer she had already accepted with the measured panic of someone who had no other plan. But acceptance didn't make the future kinder. It only made it shared. When the safe house door locked behind them and the river outside muttered secrets into the night, Leila felt the world contract into a stillness that was both terrifying and strangely urgent. She and Matteo had stepped over into each other's ways, like two strangers who decided to share an umbrella that a storm. Each step forward would leave footprints they could be judged by. Each glance could be a confession. The dilemma was set in cold ink on a page that would not be erased. Reveal the truth and risk being dismantled by the man she was beginning to care for, or protect the man and risk betraying the cause that had become her family. There was a third option, older and rarer, hovering like a thin breath at the edge of the room, one that required breaking every rule she'd ever learned, to propose a plan that might rebuild the ledger on different terms, to force transparency where secrecy had been the currency. Proposing that plan would mean asking Matteo not just to protect her, but to change. It would mean asking a man who had made a fortress of his power to open a gate. Matteo looked at her, and the night held its breath. The first obstacle had been survived. Surveillance had been noticed, offers made, alliances forged. But survival had a price, and the debt now sat before them like an invoice. Leila folded her hands in her lap and felt for the first time in a long while the warmth of another palm hovering near her own. "If you want me to," she said finally, "then stand with me while I burn the parts of your ledger that don't deserve to stand. Help me make it right. Not for your image, for the people who paid when no one noticed." It was an audacious demand. It was, perhaps, impossible. But Matteo looked at her with an expression that had both resolve and the tiredness of a man who had already paid for too many sins. "Then we'll burn it together," he said. They had crossed a line no ledger could erase. They had become conspirators in a different way. The stakes swelled like a storm on the horizon. The lanterns watched. The city blinked. Elena stirred in a distant office with suspicions that would be lethal if turned sharp. The difficulty was no longer theoretical. It sat between them, hot and humming, and the only option left was how they would set about dismantling what neither of them could fix alone. They moved as if a compact had been signed in private, a pact stitched from urgency and adrenaline. For a few burning days, the world narrowed to a roster of names and timestamps, to the small, sharp business of undoing other people's lives. Matteo moved through corridors of power with a lightness that belied the weight he carried. Meetings where he asked questions that sounded like compassion, hands that folded like promises when he spoke to regulators, a head bowed in public while his eyes, behind closed doors, searched servers and legal filings. Leila taught the lanterns to use his noise as cover and to probe the edges where his legal teams couldn't yet reach. But trust is never a clean transaction. It is indebtedness in human skin. Elena saw the indebtedness the way a hawk sees movement in the grass. Matteo's sister ran the Vercetti legal arm with the ruthless precision of someone who had been raised on edicts and fear. She loved her brother the way people love dynasties,
fiercely, possessively, with fingers that became blades when anyone threatened the family's name. When the memo surfaced on the lantern feed and the signature matched her brother's initials, she had a choice she never felt permitted to hesitate over: protect the brand or the man. She chose the brand first. Elena came to Matteo like a summons. She did not storm into his office. She entered the way one steps into a cathedral to remove a splinter of scandal from a stained glass window. Calculated, surgical, inevitable. "You gave them a wedge to drive in," she said without preamble. Her voice carried across the board table in the way winter carries its cold, unadorned and absolute. "I offered the lanterns protection," Matteo said, the words falling awkwardly around the ledger of their recent nights. "I never authorized siphons." "People will not hear that distinction," Helena said. "You gave them openings. You put yourself in proximity to a vulnerability."
The conversation tightened until their childhood memories became background static. Two kids in a kitchen of whispered vows. A mother who taught them that loyalty was currency. A father whose temper could rearrange a table. Elena pivoted from those memories with the cold economy of a woman who had learned to measure everything in outcomes. "We clean this now," she said. "We remove the leak. We take their noise offline." Matteo's idea of clean had looked different in the glow of the safe house. For him, it meant quiet, the pressure of a legal team, the careful splicing of truth and repentance. For Elena, it meant terminus. She had seen the way a company could survive a scandal with the right scapegoat. She had also seen what happened when you allowed a narrative to caress a wound and leave it open. Pests, contagion. Contagion that spread to accounts and shareholders, and then to rooms where the family ate dinner. "You want a public recantation," Matteo suggested. "A statement. Internal audit." Elena's laugh was a shudder. "We don't make statements when a rat gnaws on the pantry," she said. "We take the rat out. And if that rat walks among your allies, then the rat must be removed." It stopped being allegory when she named the rat with a calm that made Matteo feel the floor tilt. The lanterns have an informant, someone with access to your private channels. Her nails tapped the table like a metronome. "Find them and silence them, permanently." The room blinked. Matteo tasted the word silence as if it were something he had used once and could not retrieve. He had protected grudgingly, borrowed grief like old money. He had not imagined himself in the role of executioner. But he also understood, down to the marrow, that Elena did not ask for permission when she issued ultimatums. She issued them as a woman who had already counted the cost and chosen the least ruinous path. He told her he would look into it. He told her he would use restraint. He lied with the old familiar dexterity of a man who had taught himself to monetize omissions. He vowed things he planned to bend, because between Elena's purge and the city's scrutiny, there was no room for the messy righteousness he'd promised Leela. The lanterns felt the change first as a pressure behind the ears, calls unanswered, code libraries wiped and replaced, a thread in an old chat closing without explanation. Marco, the lantern who had been small in stature and large in need, grew skittish. He had been the sort to sell a password for lunch money and a kindness for rent. When Elena's people offered the right kind of kindness, legal immunity perhaps, a relocation, the flutter at safety painted in a polite envelope, Marco accepted with the quick, ashamed acceptance of a man who had always needed someone to hold his ledger. He sold Leela.
It happened with the banal cruelty of an ordinary betrayal. A late-night meeting arranged as if for a cup of coffee, a clean exchange of data for cash, a few innocuous phrases that would later be rendered as evidence. Marco's message to Elena's channel was sterile. "I can point you to the user who touched the airport protocol. Coordinates, timestamps, a username flagged in metadata that smelled of Leela's old alias." Leela found out the wrong way, by watching her friends look away. In the safe house, the conversation that should have given her a net altered into a corridor of pointed glances. People who had once typed as one against injustice now saw the world through the pale prism of self-preservation. There was a ledger, and someone was balancing it with her life on the debit side. One of the lanterns, Anna, whispered the name Marco and then hissed, "He sold us out. He sold you." The words were a blade. Leela's first reaction was animal, a hot, clawing brief that tasted like iron. She could forgive greed. She could not forgive the scaffolding of trust being carried away in secret hands. She thought of Sophia's face, of the child she had rerouted, and the horrid possibility that the same algorithmic fingers that saved a child could now expose the savior. She reached for Matteo that night because she needed a human who would not move away from the jaggedness of the truth. She needed the man who had promised to stand in front of the heat. He answered, voice rawer than she liked. "They have a name," he said. "They have coordinates. Elena wants leverage." Elena moved like a storm. Within hours, legal tendrils wrapped around the Lantern network. Subpoenas served with the kind of urgency reserved for traitors. Bank accounts frozen. A journalist whose loyalty had been purchased published a narrative that laid the leak at the feet of an anonymous hacker collective, every mention a marble thrown at the fragile face of the Lanterns. Mateo's offices issued statements about cooperation and zero tolerance for illicit activity. Elena's network worked in the dark, cataloging what would later be placed into evidence. The first direct fracture between them came like a crack in a photograph. Mateo called Lila, and for the first time since the airport, his voice was not solicitous. It was measured like a judge's. "There is an order," he said, "from Elena. She wants a scapegoat. She wants the Lantern's access. She will make an example." "You're not giving me away," Lila said. Her hands went cold with the absurdity of how much she was pleading for herself without borrowing Versetti's empire. "You said you'd stand in front of the heat." "I meant legal heat," he answered. "Not—" He stopped. He didn't say the final word because he knew it would undo everything between them. Elena's measures were surgical. They involved more than PR. They involved people who moved quicker than the law's measured footfall. "I'll do what I can," he said, and the phrase landed like a plea wrapped in compromise.
But promises betrayed by proximity are what destroy more than acts themselves. Elena, who had been watching the thin web of interactions between Mateo and Lila, moved a piece that did not require violence at first. A leak to a federal contact about an alleged insider at the Lanterns. The leak carried a name that matched a username the Lanterns used, a username Lila had typed into the dark on nights when she couldn't sleep. It wasn't her legal name that appeared initially. It was a digital trace that, when cross-referenced, pointed toward her cafe, toward the delicate business of paper receipts and petty cash. The world narrowed. Lila felt it, the way a person senses when a tide has turned and there is no friendly sandbar left. She watched Mateo through messages, watched for the firewall he'd promised. She received silence for answers and a list of lawyers for comfort. Elena did not ask, she commanded. She moved legal seals that made everything look lawful. Worse than the legal net was the Lantern's reaction. Trust collapsed into accusation. Fingers hovered over keyboards that once built maps, now building pleadings for mercy. Old friends looked at Lila with a mixture of horror and relief. If she were the leak, then their conscience could be quarterly and marketable again. Some turned their backs. Some saved their lines of code and their skins first, clicking out of chats with the delicate brutality of loaded guns. A movement that had sustained itself on anonymity and tiny lights began to fray. Mateo tried to intercede. Quiet calls to contact points. Pressure applied through channels only he could bend. He argued for a measured approach, for evidence instead of theater. Elena answered by tightening the scope. "You have a choice," she told him over the secure line. "Either you stop protecting her, or you stop protecting us." He chose both, in silence. Lila watched the man who had kissed the thin space between her fingers in the river light become a figure who negotiated her fate like a collateral. She felt the floor shift under her feet, where trust had once been anchored. Betrayal did not arrive in a single thunderclap. It arrived in locks and subpoenas and the small, fatal arithmetic of friends who prioritized survival. The fracture became physical when someone from the Lanterns forwarded a list of names to an unknown number. The next day, the cafe's back room was raided by plainclothes men with court orders. Marco watched them take a friend and did nothing. Elena's agents photographed receipts and loyalty cards and an espresso loyalty stamp, proof apparently that an activist had a day job. The media ate the narrative that had been prepared, an expert op-ed here, an anonymous tip there. Lila's face, once a stranger among faces, was drawn like a map on feeds that reached millions. Mateo showed up at the cafe as the shutters came down. He moved between the officers and the owner with a maneuverability born of decades in rooms where violence masqueraded as negotiation. He took a file from an officer with a hand steady as a metronome and walked into the cool back room where Lila stood with her palms white on the counter. The air smelled of burnt coffee and fear. "I'm not handing you over," he said. Elena's men had framed it as evidence. The state's case would be a tidy thing of algorithms and paper, but the fracture had widened beyond paperwork. It was a moral one. Lila looked at him with eyes that had been hollowed by betrayal, and something in her broke quietly, the sound of a hinge that will never quite close the same way again. "You promised," she whispered. "I did," he said, and the promise fell flat, a coin that no longer bought absolution. Elena had won a path by making his hands too full. The legal scaffolding had been erected so that Mateo could spare his family while the company purged its stain.
He had tried to protect her with the gloves he knew how to wear, but those gloves were not enough for the hands used to brutality. When the doors closed behind her, the cafe hummed in the emptiness of equipment and the absence of small honesty. Leela was led away under the pretense of questioning. Her phone buzzed with messages she could no longer answer. In the safe house, Mateo watched with a kind of slow, consuming grief that was not regret for his actions alone, but for what his world demanded of him. The fracture was not healed that night. It was a wound, open and raw, between a man who traded an empire and a woman who had rerouted a child's death for reasons that could not be explained without killing the myth of heroism. Elena's victory was a ledger balanced at the cost of 2 lives being rearranged, the company's image and the woman's freedom. Outside, a drizzle washed the neon into smeared watercolor. Inside, a silence pressed so dense that both Mateo and Leela could hear it echo with every broken promise. The city breathed around them, indifferent and loud, and in that breath the world had shifted. Distrust now rode the same train as desire, and both of them would have to learn how to survive within a map that had been redrawn in secrecy and betrayal. Mateo closed the file, and for the first time in a long while, felt the shape of an act he could not unmake. Elena had engineered a legal snare so precise it left no room for improvisation. The law would take its course, and the company would survive because someone would be sacrificed. He had seen the ledger of options: dismissal, negotiation, exile, and each one felt like pruning a wound into a scar. Then he thought of Leela in the interrogation room, her hands white on a counter that smelled of bleach and old paper, and something in him that was not ledger or reputation snapped into a single, dangerous clarity. Some debts are only paid with a life on the line.
He called Marco's name like a verdict and hated how easily it slid from his mouth. Marco had sold them out for lunch money and a promise of safety. A man who had once wanted to be useful had become a coin in Elena's pocket. Mateo could have crushed Marco in a way that would have silenced the leak and repaved the road with a blunt instrument. He did not. The cost of that kind of violence would have been a ledger stain that couldn't be excised. Instead, he chose a sacrament he had never learned: to give up the thing that made him untouchable. He drafted a confession that was not entirely true and entirely brave. In it, he admitted to authorizing questionable transfers, small, technocratic lies he had ordered under duress and pride, enough to make his family look culpable but not grotesquely criminal. He promised full cooperation, asset relinquishment, a resignation that would be framed as contrition. He signed it with his name and the weight of decades, and then handed it to Elena with the kind of calm that meant he had already settled accounts with fear. "This will save you," he told her. "It will buy time, and maybe it will buy her freedom." Elena looked at the paper and at the man across from her, the man whose sacrifices she had always calculated in terms of family continuity. For a long moment her eyes read him like an auditor's. They found gaps and line items. But there was a sliver of something else there, a sister's knowledge of what grief could do to a man. "You do this," she said quietly, "and you lose more than the company will forgive." "I already have," he said. "I lost something when I signed that other order. This is restitution." She touched the paper as if it might burn, and then took the pen. Her signature felt like surrender or triumph. Mateo could not tell which. Within hours, the story unfolded exactly as he'd arranged: a mea culpa, a resignation, a vow to cooperate. The press ate it like a memorial. Elena stood at the periphery with the cold satisfaction of a woman who had trimmed the family tree to ensure the house remained upright. The bargain worked, in the way bargains do: incompletely, expensively. Leela was released on conditional terms: no international travel, periodic check-ins, and a pending legal review that would take months. Marco received immunity in exchange for testimony. The lanterns dissolved into an uneasy diaspora of those too scared to be seen together. The company weathered the storm. The Vercetti name lost a corner of its polish, but kept its foundations. But the real cost was something Mateo could not write into a press release. He had traded the kind of power that bought silence and shaped markets for a vulnerability that lived in headlines. The world now knew he could be held to account. His brotherhood with fear had been publicly severed. He had stepped into a legal spotlight that would force him to open rooms he'd kept shuttered.
For someone who had built an empire on the language of omission, the admission felt like divorce. He told Leela nothing of the negotiations when she first stumbled into the safe house, hair damp from the night's rain, eyes red but fierce, the kind of woman who had survived being erased and lived to name her scars. She saw only the man who had walked into the room with the light of exhaustion on his face. "You did this," she said. He nodded. "I did what I could." "You lied to me," she said, and the accusation carried the ache of everything they had been trying to save. "You promised to stand in front of the heat. You stood in it, but you did it by signing us over. Elena wins, Marco keeps his safety, the lanterns lose. I lose." He stepped closer, closing the small distance that had always been measured in guarded glances and careful words. "I chose a way that would cost me," he said, "not you, not the child who matters to me. I chose to be accountable in a way I never allowed myself to be." Her laugh was a broken thing that tasted of rain. "You think this is accountability? You put your reputation into a basket and threw it into the ocean, thinking the tide will wash everything clean. Some things don't wash up." "Maybe not," he said, "but I couldn't." He stopped, because what he wanted to say would be a confession too naked for the world, that he could not lose her. That the ledger his family had kept for generations had taught him to sacrifice only strangers. "I couldn't let them take you without making the same thing I had been protecting pay the price." It was an ugly truth wrapped in a tender one. Leela looked at him as if trying to read the bookkeeping of his soul. She saw fatigue and resolve braided together, and something like a child's gratitude for being known. "You didn't have to do it alone," she said. "You could have told me." "I didn't want you to become collateral," he said. "I wanted to shelter you until we could pull the whole thing open. I failed at that." They were two people at the edge of a new geography, one who had wielded power as protection and one who had used anonymity for justice. In the quiet that followed, Matteo did the only thing left that felt honest. He laid down a condition that would make the bargain real. "I will relinquish control of certain accounts to an independent trustee," he said. "I'll open some of our philanthropy to external audit. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Leel's shoulders eased with the shape of the concession. It was not salvation, but it was a promise bent toward repair. She reached for his hand and met his fingers halfway, an exchange that was far more costly than any legal document. "Then we make it right," she said. "Not for image, not for your family, for the people who don't have a ledger." Outside, Elena watched the settlement as one judges a theater, with the rare indulgence of someone who has trimmed the cast list to her liking.
She would accept the cost if it meant the house stayed upright. In private, she cataloged contingencies. In public, she rehearsed mercy. Matteo's sacrifice had given her space to breathe, and the Vercetti name a way to weather scandal. She had won, though not in the neatness she preferred. She had also, unexpectedly, lost the unseeing certainty she'd always enjoyed, that everything could be ordered and contained. The night Matteo and Leela spent after the release was not cinematic. It was small and human. Two people who had been almost strangers in a city of neon and code, sitting on the floor of a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner, sharing a packet of biscuits that tasted like compromise. They spoke in fragments, about Sophia's laugh recorded in Matteo's phone, about the ledger of unpaid debts Leela had found in a cardboard box years ago, about the cost of being brave in a world that rewarded anonymity with exile. When the knock came at the door hours later, Elena's voice on the other side, apologetic and crisp, Matteo answered it alone. He stepped into the corridor with the calm of a man who had decided to step fully into the consequences of his own choices. Elena's envoy handed him an envelope, documents that made his resignation formal and his asset transfers legal. She said simply, "You chose the woman." He looked back once at the apartment where Leela slept folded like